Hi guys, welcome to Boogers, where we explore fascinating moments in history. My name is Trenton,
And I am Glenn.
and we will be talking about the Pacific Campaign and the Manhattan Project, and going to explore the Manhattan Project and the Pacific Campaign, crucial moments in history that changed the course of the world. Hey Glenn, are you excited to talk about the Pacific Campaign and the Manhattan Project?
Yes, I am ready to learn about the topic.
You may be asking yourself what led to the Manhattan Project and the Pacific Campaign. What did the Manhattan Project and the Pacific Campaign do? So let's find out by answering these questions.
Today, to understand the Pacific Campaign and the Manhattan Project, we first need to go back to 1939 to 1944. In that time, Japan launched a relentless assault that swept through the U.S. territories of Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, as well as British-controlled Hong Kong, Malaya, and Burma. An entire generations of Americans and our allies come together to defend democracy and defeat the forces of oppression and tyranny in Japan and Germany. And they paid an absolutely terrible price for the victory. The end of World War II provided an opportunity for millions of Americans, and by the end of the war, the nation emerged as the world's dominant military war. During the war, 6 million women had joined the workforce for the first time. The total of the workforce was 35% in the manufacturing industry. At the end of the war, over 85% of women wanted to keep their jobs, but they weren't able to do so.
The Manhattan Project was created because people who fled Nazi Germany were worried that Germany might create a nuclear weapon. And the Manhattan Project took place on June 18, 1942 and August 25, 1947. The Manhattan Project developed and deployed the world's first atomic weapon. The first atomic bomb was called Trinity, and exploded at Alamogordo Base on July 16, 1945. Do you know what were the long-term results of the Manhattan Project?
The Manhattan Project marked the beginning of the atomic age and shaped the Cold War. They tried to keep the Manhattan Project secret by talking to the FBI about the person that is trying to work on the project. The FBI would check if the person has no criminal background or if they had any connections with Axis sympathizers. It would take several weeks for that person to get cleared, and sometimes the FBI would get in touch with close family members or former employers of any suspicious that might be raised during the investigation. And security officials would search all the mail because they wanted to make sure that any information regarding a site's location, work activity, or technical details was removed. Every worker that is working with the Manhattan Project had to sign a form pledging silence about the Manhattan Project. Why did they have to sign a form pledging silence about the Manhattan Project?
Every worker that worked around the Manhattan Project had to sign a form because it was very necessary for security reasons. The goal was to keep the atomic bomb secret from Germany and Japan, and the Manhattan security succeeded in keeping it secret from those countries, but failed to keep it secret from the Soviet Union. How did the Soviet Union find out about the atomic bomb?
The Soviet Union had spies that penetrated the Manhattan Project. This made them send information to Russians and helped them speed up the development of the Soviet bomb. Americans chose to drop the atomic bombs because they believed an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cause 1 million American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. There were 2 million civilian casualties in Kyushu alone. If the operation had been executed as planned, it would have been the largest bloodbath in American history. Anyway, the American forces had all the firepower and they were better trained and equipped than the Japanese army.
At the start of World War II, the United States government arrested tens of thousands of Japanese Americans and moved them to camps in California, Washington, and Oregon. The Executive 9066 means moving Japanese Americans to camps to prevent espionage. So, Glenn, tell me, what were the relocation centers like?
People in the assembly centers just got paid to do work. The relocation centers had several families that lived together, but residents that were labeled as dissidents had no choice but to go to a special camp in Lutule Lake, California. Each relocation center was its own town and had their own schools, workplaces, post offices, and farmland for growing food. All prison camps were surrounded by barbed wires and guard towers.
In 1942, Fred Korimatsu was a 23-year-old Japanese American, and he was arrested because he refused to relocate to a prison camp. Korimatsu made it all the way to the Supreme Court, but he lost. But he went on to become a civil rights activist and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 1945, prison camps ended following the Supreme Court decision. In that case, the war relocation power has no authority to subject citizens who are concededly loyal to its leave procedure, the court unanimously said in this instance.
The last Japanese internment camp closed in March 1946. They were allowed to return home, but many of them did not have a home to return because their homes, businesses, and livelihood had been seized by the government, leaving thousands homeless and penniless. Congress officially apologized in 1988 and issued $20,000 to any survivors or their families.
The outcome of the Pacific Campaign was that it was only a matter of time before Japan surrendered or the Allies invaded its home islands. After U.S. atomic bombs devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan accepted terms of surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the brutal Pacific War came to an end, and the outcome of the Manhattan Project influenced other nuclear programs, but in the United Kingdom and France and among other countries. The impact of the Pacific Campaign was that the war provided an opportunity for millions of Americans, and by the end of the war, the nation emerged as the world's dominant economic and military power.
The Battle of Midway of the Pacific Campaign was in June 1942. U.S. and Japanese naval force engaged in a 5-day battle in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. The reason why Japan invaded the Philippines is because the Philippines had resources and took American military bases that were near Japan.
The fighting of the Guadalcanal was a turning point for the Allies in the Pacific Campaign of World War II. The victory of the Guadalcanal was the Allies were able to launch in subsequent operations against Japan. and Japan could only defend fewer and fewer naval, aerial, and army assets. Japan lost over 1,200 experienced pilots and lost 38 naval vessels and lost over 20,000 army troops. Japan's capability was left in the ruins. Japan's industrial output could not keep up with these losses. The Americans could easily replace similar losses, but Imperial Japan couldn't.
The invasion of Iwo Jima was when the Japanese commander recognized that they couldn't defeat the Americans landing, so they planned a defense that would cost many American lives and make them rethink continuing to fight the war. The general put his forces in the northern part of the island where gun positions and bunkers connect by tunnels.
The celebration of the flag raising erupted when the Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, and raised a small American flag. Later, another detachment returned and replaced the small flag into a larger one. Glenn, talk about the invasion of Okinawa.
The invasion of Okinawa, 60,000 U.S. Marines stormed ashore to Okinawa. The U.S. encountered a network of Japan. A savage fighting erupted at the island's southern end. Natural defensive positions covered the island, leading to a vicious land and sea and air that lasted nearly 3 months. Okinawa savagery led to a terrible death that could follow in anticipated invasions of Japan's home. While they quickly overcame defensive of Okinawa, the south was a problem because Japan anchored their defenses and supported a series of defended high ridges. Surrey Castle fell on May 29 and Marines seized that airfield at Naha through an amphibious assault commencing June 4, 1945.
These battles are part of the campaign island hopping by the U.S. military guarding at Midway and ending at Okinawa. The U.S. targeted key islands and the small islands to capture and hopped island to island to get closer to Japan so they could bring bombs within range to the enemy's homeland and prepare to invade Japan. This campaign allowed American bombers relentlessly pound Japan day and night, devastating Japanese infrastructure as well as military and civilian production capability. The bombs launched from island captures in this campaign became the final stroke and the biggest achievement of the military effort.
So to recap, the Pacific Campaign was a turning point in history because the Pacific Campaign killed so many Japanese soldiers and civilians and killed American soldiers. Casualties of the Pacific Campaign was that 2 million Japanese, including 700,000 civilians, were killed and died from disease or starvation. The U.S. suffered the greatest losses with more than 100,000 killed in action. Nearly 6,000 American civilians were killed in action. The Manhattan Project was a turning point in history due to its role in making the world's first bombs.
What do you think would have happened if the Pacific Campaign or the Manhattan Project had never taken place? History would have been a lot different today. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Bugukers for more deep dives in history. Feel free to share your thoughts with us on YouTube or Canvas. Until next time, keep exploring the past to understand the present. And with that, the season 3 episode 5 comes to an end. Good night.